worked. Hello everyone, I am number one Marmaduke fan. Welcome to the absolute coziest part of your week. It's Fairy Tale Friday. We are in bed under the thick covers, and we are going to continue the adventure of the Princess and the Goblin. I see we are live, and I'm going to send out the tweet, and then I will have a peek at the live stream chat. So everyone, how is your week going? Excellent. All right, I think I'm the only one here for now, but that's all right. We always get new people here on the show. So let's do a quick recap. Where last our story began with Princess Irene, who has never seen the stars once in her life due to her father's fear of the goblins. One day, she is exploring in the attic and meets a strange figure who claims to be her great-great-grandmother, but who also seems to have a bit of a magical quality to her. After exploring with her matronly nursemaid Ludi, Princess Irene and Ludi become lost and are accosted by the goblins when they are rescued by the intrepid young working-class lad, Curdy the miner boy, who Princess Irene wishes to reward with a kiss, but the intrepid Ludi prevents her from kissing him at the last minute. And we learn that the goblins only fear the power of song. With that will bring us to Chapter 7, The Mines. Curdy went home, whistling. He resolved to say nothing about the princess for fear of getting the nurse into trouble, for while he enjoyed teasing her because of her absurdity, he was careful not to do her any harm. He saw no more of the goblins, and was soon fast asleep in his bed. He woke in the middle of the night, and thought he heard curious noises outside. He sat up and listened, then got up, and, opening the door very quickly, went out. When he peeped round the corner, he saw, under his own window, a group of stumpy creatures, whom he at once recognized by their shape. Hardly, however, had he begun his 1, 2, 3, when they broke asunder, scurried away, and were out of sight. He returned laughing, got into bed again, and was fast asleep in a moment. Reflecting a little over the matter in the morning, he came to the conclusion that, as nothing of the kind had ever happened before, they must be annoyed with him for interfering to protect the princess. By the time he was dressed, however, he was thinking of something quite different, for he did not value the enmity of the goblins in the least. Excuse me. As soon as they had had breakfast, he set off with his father for the mine. They entered the hill by a natural opening under a huge rock, where a little stream rushed out. They followed its course for a few yards when the passages took a turn and sloped steeply into the heart of the hill, with many angles and windings and branchings off, and sometimes with steps where it came upon a natural gulf. It led them deep into the hill before they arrived at the place where they were at present digging out the precious ore. This was of various kinds, for the mountain was very rich in the better sorts of metals. With flint and steel and tinderbox, they lighted their lamps and fixed them on their heads, and were soon hard at work with their pickaxes and shovels and hammers. Father and son were at work near each other, but not in the same gang. The passages out of which the ore was dug they called gangs, for when the lode or vein of ore was small, one miner would have to dig away alone in a passage no bigger than gave him just room to work, sometimes in uncomfortable, cramped positions. If they stopped for a moment, they could hear everywhere around them, some nearer, some farther off, the sounds of their companions burrowing away in all directions in the inside of the great mountain, some boring holes in the rock in order to blow it up with gunpowder, others shoveling the broken ore into baskets to be carried to the mouth of the mine, others hitting away with their pickaxes. Sometimes, if the miner were in a very lonely part, he would hear only a tapping, no louder than that of a woodpecker, for the sound would come from a great distance off through the solid mountain rock. The work was hard at best, for it is very warm underground. But it was not particularly unpleasant, and some of the miners, when they wanted to earn a little more money for a particular purpose, would stop behind the rest and work all night. But you could not tell night from day down there, except from feeling tired and sleepy, for no light of the sun ever came into those gloomy regions. Some who had thus remained behind during the night, although certain there were none of their companions at work, would declare the next morning that they heard, every time they halted for a moment to take breath, a tapping all about them, as if the mountain were then more full of miners than ever it was during the day, and some in consequence would never stay overnight, for all knew those were the sounds of the goblins. They worked only at night, for the miners' night was the goblins' day. Indeed, the greater number of the miners were afraid of the goblins, for there were strange stories well known amongst them of the treatment some had received whom the goblins had surprised at their work during the night. The more courageous of them, however, amongst them Peter Peterson and Curdie, who in this took after his father, had stayed in the mine all night again and again, and although they had several times encountered a few stray goblins, had never yet failed in driving them away. As I have indicated already, the chief defense against them was verse, for they hated verse of every kind, and some kinds they could not endure at all. I suspect they could not make any themselves, and that was why they disliked it so much. At all events, those who were most afraid of them were those who could neither make verses themselves nor remember the verses that other people made for them, while those who were never afraid were those who could make verses for themselves. For although there were certain old rhymes which were very effectual, yet it was well known that a new rhyme, if of the right sort, was even more distasteful to them, and therefore more effectual in putting them to flight. Perhaps my readers may be wondering what the goblins could be about, working all night long, seeing that they never carried up the ore and sold it. But when I have informed them concerning what Curdie learned the very next night, they will be able to understand. For Curdie had determined, if his father would permit him, to remain there alone this night, and that for two reasons. First, he wanted to get extra wages that he might buy a very warm red petticoat for his mother, who had begun to complain of the cold of the mountain air sooner than usual this autumn. And second, he had just a faint hope of finding out what the goblins were about under his window the night before. When he told his father, he made no objection, for he had great confidence in his boy's courage and resources. "I'm sorry I can't stay with you," said Peter, "but I want to go and pay the parson a visit this evening. And besides, I've had a bit of a headache all day." "I'm sorry for that, father," said Curdie. "Oh, it's not much. You'll be sure to take care of yourself, won't you?" "Yes, father, I will. I'll keep a sharp lookout, I promise you." Curdie was the only one who remained in the mine. About 6 o'clock the rest went away, everyone bidding him good night and telling him to take care of himself, for he was a great favorite with them all. "Don't forget your rhymes," said one. "No, no," answered Curdie. "It's no matter if he does," said another, "for he'll only have to make a new one." "Yes, but he mightn't be able to make it fast enough," said another, "and while it was cooking in his head, they might take a mean advantage and set upon him." "I'll do my best," said Curdie. "I'm not afraid." "We all know that," they returned, and left him. Chapter 8. The Goblins. For some time, Curdie worked away briskly, throwing all the ore he had disengaged on one side behind him to be ready for carrying out in the morning. He heard a good deal of goblin tapping, but it all sounded far away in the hill, and he paid it little heed. Towards midnight he began to feel rather hungry, so he dropped his pickaxe, got out a lump of bread, which in the morning he had laid in a damp hole in the rock, sat down on a heap of ore, and ate his supper. Then he leaned back for 5 minutes' rest, before beginning his work again, and laid his head... I think I jumped a line there. Yeah. And I'm just going to back up a sentence. Towards midnight, he began to feel rather hungry, so he dropped his pickaxe, got out a lump of bread, which in the morning he had laid in a damp hole in the rock, sat down on a heap of ore, and ate his supper. Then he leaned back for 5 minutes' rest, before beginning his work again, and laid his head against the rock. He had not kept the position for 1 minute before he heard something which made him sharpen his ears. It sounded like a voice inside the rock. After a while, he heard it again. It was a goblin voice. There could be no doubt about that, and this time he couldn't make out the words. "Hadn't we better be moving?" it said. A rougher and deeper voice replied. "There's no hurry. That wretched little mole won't be through tonight, if he work ever so hard. He's not by any means at the thinnest place." "But you still think the load does come into our house," said the first voice. "Yes, but a good bit farther on than he has got to yet. Yes, but a good bit farther on than he has got to yet. If he had struck a stroke more to the side just here," said the goblin, tapping the very stone, as it seemed to Curdie, against which his head lay, "he would have been through, but he's a couple of yards past it now, and if he follow the load, it will be a week before it leads him in. You see it back there, a long way. Still, perhaps, in case of accident, it would be as well to be getting out of this. Helfer, you'll take the great chest. That's your business, you know." "Yes, Dad," said a third voice, but you must help me to get it on my back. It's awfully heavy, you know." "Well, it isn't just a bag of smoke, I admit, but you're as strong as a mountain, Helfer." "You say so, Dad. I think myself I'm all right, but I could carry 10 times as much if it wasn't for my feet." "That is your weak point, I confess, my boy." "Ain't it yours too, Father?" "Well, to be honest, it's a goblin weakness. Why they come so soft, I declare I haven't an idea." "'Specially when your head's so hard, you know, Father." "Yes, my boy, the goblin's glory is his head. To think how the fellows up above there have to put on helmets and things when they go fighting. Ha ha!" "But why don't we wear shoes like them, Father? I should like it, especially when I've got a chest like that on my head." "Well, you see, it's not the fashion. The king never wears shoes." "The Queen does." "Yes, but that's for distinction. The first queen, you see, I mean the king's first wife, wore shoes, of course, because she came from upstairs. And so, when she died, the next queen would not be inferior to her, as she called it, and would wear shoes too. It was all pride. She is the hardest in forbidding them to the rest of the women." "I'm sure I would—" "Oh," said the first voice. "I'm sure I wouldn't wear them. No, not for that I wouldn't," said the first voice, which was evidently that of the mother of the family. "I can't think why either of them should." "Didn't I tell you the first was from upstairs?" said the other. "That was the only silly thing I ever knew His Majesty guilty of. Why should he marry an outlandish woman like that? One of our natural enemies, too." "I suppose he fell in love with her." "Pooh-pooh. He's just as happy now with one of his own people." Did she die very soon? They didn't tease her to death, did they?" "Oh, dear, no. The king worshipped her very footmarks." "What made her die, then? Didn't the heir agree with her?" "She died when the young prince was born." "How silly of her! We never do that. It must have been because she wore shoes." "I don't know that." "Why do they wear shoes up there?" "Ah, now that's a sensible question, and I will answer it. But in order to do so, I must first tell you a secret. I once saw the queen's feet." "Without her shoes?" "Yes, without her shoes." "No, did ya? How was it?" "Never you mind how it was. She didn't know I saw them. And what do you think? They had toes." "Toes? What's that?" "You may well ask. I should never have known if I had not seen the queen's feet. Just imagine, the ends of her feet were split up into 5 or 6 thin pieces." "Oh, horrid! How could the king have fallen in love with her?" "You forget that she wore shoes. That is just why she wore them. That is why all the men and women, too, upstairs wear shoes. They can't bear the sight of their own feet without them. Ah, now I understand. If you ever wish for shoes again, Helfer, I'll hit your feet, I will. No, no, mother, pray don't. Then don't ya. But with such a big box on my head, a horrid scream followed, which Curdie interpreted as in reply to a blow from his mother upon the feet of her eldest goblin. Well, I never knew so much before, remarked a fourth voice. Your knowledge is not universal quite yet, said the father. You were only 50 last month. Mind you see to the bed and bedding. As soon as we've finished our supper, we'll be up and going. Ha ha ha! What are you laughing at, husband? I'm laughing to think what a mess the miners will find themselves in, somewhere before this day 10 years. Why, what do you mean? Oh, nothing. Oh, yes, you do mean something. You always do mean something. It's more than you do then, wife. That may be, but it's not more than I find out, you know. Ha ha! You're a sharp one. What a mother you've got, Helfer. Yes, father. Well, I suppose I must tell you. They're all at the palace consulting about it tonight. And as soon as we've gotten away from this thin place, I'm going there to hear what And as soon as we've got away from this thin place, I'm going there to hear what night they fix upon. I should like to see that young ruffian there on the other side, struggling in the agonies of... He dropped his voice so low that Curdie could hear only a growl. The growl went on into the low bass for a good while, as inarticulate as if the goblin's tongue had been a sausage, and it was not until his wife spoke again that it rose to its former pitch. But what shall we do when you are at the palace? She asked. I will see you safe in the new house I've been digging for you for the last 2 months. Pudge, you mind the table and chairs. I commit them to your care. The table has 7 legs, each chair 3. I shall require them all at your hands. After this arose a confused conversation about the various household goods and their transport, and Curdie heard nothing more that was of any importance. He now knew at least one of the reasons for the constant sound of the goblin hammers and pickaxes at night. They were making new houses for themselves, to which they might retreat when the miners should threaten to break into their dwellings. But he had learned 2 things of far greater importance. The first was that some grievous calamity was preparing and almost ready to fall upon the heads of the miners. The second was the one weak point of a goblin's body. He had not known that their feet were so tender, as he had now reason to suspect. He had heard it said that they had no toes. He had never had opportunity of inspecting them closely enough, in the dusk in which they always appeared, to satisfy himself whether it was a correct report. Indeed, he had not been able even to satisfy himself as to whether they had never been able even to satisfy himself as to whether they had no fingers, although that also was commonly said to be the fact. One of the miners, indeed, who had had more schooling than the rest, was wont to argue that such must have been the primordial condition of humanity, and that education and handicraft had developed both toes and fingers, with which proposition Curdie had once heard his father sarcastically agree, alleging, in support of it, the probability that babies' gloves were a traditional remnant of the old state of things, while the stockings of all ages, no regard being paid in them to the toes, pointed in the same direction. But what was important was the fact concerning the softness of the goblin feet, which he foresaw might be useful to all miners. What he had to do in the meantime, however, was to discover, if possible, the special evil design the goblins had now in their heads. Although he knew all the gangs and all the natural galleries with which they communicated in the mined part of the mountain, he had not the least idea where the palace of the king of the gnomes was. Otherwise, he would have set out at once on the enterprise of excuse me. Otherwise, he would have set out at once on the enterprise of discovering what the said design was. He judged, and rightly, that it must lie in a farther part of the mountain, between which and the mine there was yet, between which and the mine there was as yet no communication. There must be one nearly completed, however, for it could be but a thin partition which now separated them. If only he could get through in time to follow the goblins as they retreated. A few blows would doubtless be sufficient, just where his ear now lay. But if he attempted to strike there with his pickaxe, he would only hasten the departure of the family, put them on their guard, and perhaps lose their involuntary guidance. He therefore began to feel the wall with his hands, and soon found that some of the stones were loose enough to be drawn out with little noise. Laying hold of a large one with both of his hands, he drew it gently out and let it down softly. I misspoke. Laying hold of a large one with both his hands, he drew it gently out and let it down softly.
"What was that noise?"
said the goblin father. Curdie blew out his light, lest it should shine through. "It must be that one miner that stayed behind the rest," said the mother.
"No, he's been gone a good while. I haven't heard a blow for an hour. Besides, it wasn't like that."
"Then I suppose it must have been a stone carried down the brook inside."
"Perhaps it will have more room by and by."
Curdie kept quite still. After a little while, hearing nothing but the sounds of their preparations for departure, he mingled with an occasional word of direction. After a little while, hearing nothing but the sounds of their preparations for departure, mingled with an occasional word of direction, and anxious to know whether the removal of the stone had made an opening into the goblin's house, he put in his hand to feel. It went in a good way, and then came in contact with something soft. He had but a moment to feel it. It was so quickly withdrawn. It was one of the toeless goblin feet. The owner of it gave a cry of fright. "What's the matter, Helfer?" asked his mother. "A beast came out of the wall and licked my foot."
Nonsense! There are no wild beasts in our country," said the father.
"But it was, father. I felt it."
"Nonsense, I say! Will you malign your native realms and reduce them to a level with the country upstairs? That is swarming with wild beasts of every description."
"But I did feel it, father."
"I tell you to hold your tongue. You are no patriot."
Curdie suppressed his laughter and lay still as a mouse, but no stiller. For every moment he kept nibbling away with his fingers at the edges of the hole. He was slowly making it bigger, for here the rock had been very much shattered with the blasting. There seemed to be a good many in the family, to judge from the mass of confused talk, which now and then came through the hole. But when all were speaking together, and just as if they had bottle brushes, each at least one in their throats, it was not easy to make out much that was said. At length he heard once more what the father goblin was saying.
"Now then," he said, "get your bundles on your backs. Here, Helfer, I'll help you up with your chest."
"I wish it was my chest, father."
"Your turn will come in good time enough. Make haste. I must go to the meeting at the palace tonight. When that's over, we can come back and clear out the last of the things before our enemies return in the morning. Now light your torches and come along. What a distinction this is, to provide our own light, instead of being dependent on a thing hung up in the air. A most disagreeable contrivance, intended no doubt to blind us when we venture out under its baleful influence. Quite glaring and vulgar, I call it, though no doubt useful to poor creatures who haven't the wit to make light for themselves."
Curdie could hardly keep himself from calling through to know whether they made the fire to light their Curdie could hardly keep himself from calling through to know whether they made the fire to light their torches by, but a moment's reflection showed him that they would have said they did, inasmuch as they struck 2 stones together, and the fire came. Let's do one more chapter, because these goblin voices are killing me. Chapter 9, The Hall of the Goblin Palace. A sound of many soft feet followed, but soon ceased. Then Curdie flew at the hole like a tiger and tore and pulled. The sides gave way, and it was soon large enough for him to crawl through. He would not betray himself by rekindling his lamp, but the torches of the retreating company, which he found departing in a straight line up a long avenue from the door of the cave, threw back light enough to afford him a glance round the deserted home of the goblins. To his surprise, he could discover nothing to distinguish it from an ordinary natural cave in the rock, upon many of which he had come with the rest of the miners in the process of their excavations. The goblins had talked of coming back for the rest of their household gear. He saw nothing that would have made him suspect a family had taken shelter there for a single night. The floor was rough and stony, the walls full of projecting corners, the roof in one place 20 feet high, in another endangering his forehead, while on one side of a stream, no thicker than a needle, it is true, but still sufficient to spread a wide dampness all over the wall, flowed down the face of the rock. But the troop in front of him was toiling under heavy burdens. He could distinguish Helfer. He could distinguish Helfer now and then, in the flickering light and shade, with his heavy chest on his bending shoulders, while the second brother was almost buried in what looked like a great feather bed. Where did they get the feathers? Thought Curdie. But in a moment the troop disappeared at a turn of the way, and it was now both safe and necessary for Curdie to follow them, lest they should be round the next turning before he saw them again, for so he might lose them altogether. He darted after them like a greyhound. When he reached the corner and looked cautiously round, he saw them again at some distance down another long passage. None of the galleries he saw that night bore signs of the work of man, or of goblin either. Stalactites, far older than the mines, hung from their roofs, and their floors were rough with boulders and large round stones, showing that there water must have once run. He waited again at this corner till they had disappeared round the next, and so followed them a long way through one passage after another. The passages grew more and more lofty, and were more and more covered in the roof with shining stalactites. It was a strange enough procession which he followed, but the strangest part of it was the household animals which crowded amongst the feet of the goblins. It was true they had no wild animals down there. At least they did not know of any, but they had a wonderful number of tame ones. And hello, Wyatt Watts. Welcome to the reading. Thank you for joining us. We are reading The Princess and the Goblin, and I think we're on chapter 9. This will be our last chapter for the night before bed. I must, however, reverse any contributions towards the natural history of these for a later... I must, however, reserve any contributions towards the natural history of these for a later position in my story. At length, turning a corner too abruptly, he had almost rushed into the middle of the goblin family, for there they had already set down all their burdens on the floor of a cave considerably larger than that which they had left. They were as yet too breathless to speak, else he would have had warning of their arrest. He started back, however, before anyone saw him, and retreating a good way, stood watching till the father should come out to go to the palace. Before very long, both he and his son Helfer appeared and kept on in the same direction as before, while Curdie followed them again with renewed precaution. For a long time he heard no sound except something like the rush of a river inside the rock. But at length what seemed the far-off noise of a great shouting reached his ears, which, however, presently ceased. After advancing a good way farther, he thought he heard a single voice. It sounded clearer and clearer as he went on, until at last he could almost distinguish the words. In a moment or two, keeping after the goblins round another corner, he once more started back, this time in amazement. He was at the entrance of a magnificent cavern of an oval shape, once probably a huge natural reservoir of water, now the great palace hall of the Goblins. It rose to a tremendous height, but the roof was composed of such shining materials, and the multitude of torches carried by the goblins who crowded the floor lighted up the place so brilliantly that Curdie could see to the top quite well. But he had no idea how immense the palace was until his eyes had got accustomed to it, which was not for a good many minutes. The rough projections on the walls and the shadows thrown upwards from them by the torches. The rough projections on the walls and the shadows thrown upwards from them by the torches made the sides of the chamber look as if they were crowded with statues upon brackets and pedestals, reaching in irregular tiers from floor to roof. The walls themselves were in many parts of gloriously shining substances, some of them gorgeously colored besides, which powerfully contrasted with the shadows. Curdie could not help wondering whether his rhymes would be of any use against such a multitude of goblins as filled the floor of the hall, and indeed felt considerably tempted to begin his shout of 1, 2, 3. But as there was no reason for routing them, and much for endeavoring to discover their designs, he kept himself perfectly quiet, and peering round the edge of the doorway, listened with both his sharp ears. At the other end of the hall, high above the heads of the multitude, was a terrace-like ledge of considerable height, caused by the receding of the upper part of the cabin wall. Upon this sat the king and his court. The king on a throne hollowed out of a huge block of green copper ore, and his court upon lower seats around it. The king had been making them a speech, and the applause which followed it was what Curdie had heard. One of the court was now addressing the multitude. What he heard him say was to the following effect.
Hence it appears that two plans have been for some time working together in the strong head of His Majesty for the deliverance of his people, regardless of the fact that we were the first possessors of the regions they now inhabit, regardless equally of the fact that we abandoned that region from the loftiest motives, regardless also of the self-evident fact that we excel them so far in mental ability as they excel us in stature. They look upon us as a degraded race and make a mockery of all our finer feelings. But the time has almost arrived when, thanks to His Majesty's inventive genius, it will be in our power to take a thorough revenge upon them once and for all, in respect of their unfriendly behavior.
"May it please your Majesty," cried a voice close by the door, which Curdie recognized as that of the goblin he had fought. Oh, the big dad goblin. Okay, we need his voice.
"May it please your Majesty,"
cried a voice close by the door, which Curdie recognized as that of the goblin he had followed.
"Who is he that interrupts the Chancellor?"
cried another from near the throne.
"Glump,"
answered several voices.
"He is our trusty subject,"
said the king himself, in a slow and stately voice.
"Let him come forward and speak."
A lane was parted through the crowd, and Glump, having ascended the platform and bowed to the king, spoke as follows.
"Sire, I would have held my peace had I not known that I only knew that I... Sire, I would have held my peace had I not known that I only knew how near was the moment to which the Chancellor had just referred. In all probability, before another day is past, the enemy will have broken through into my house, the partitions between being even now not more than a foot in thickness."
Not quite so much, thought Curdie to himself.
"This very evening I have had to remove my household effects. Therefore, the sooner we are ready to carry out the plan, for the execution of which His Majesty has been making such magnificent preparations, the better. I may just add that within the last few days I have perceived a small outbreak in my dining room, which, combined with observations upon the house of the river escaping where the evil men enter, has convinced me that close to the spot must be a deep gulf in its channel. This discovery will, I trust, add considerably to the otherwise immense forces at His Majesty's disposal."
He ceased, and the king graciously acknowledged his speech with a bend of his head, whereupon Glump, after a bow to his majesty, slid down amongst the rest of the undistinguished multitude. Then the chancellor rose and resumed. "The information which the worthy Glump has given us," he said, "might have been of considerable import at the present moment, but for that other design already referred to, which naturally takes precedence." Excuse me, I've got like gas or something. "His Majesty, unwilling to proceed to extremities, and well aware that such measures sooner or later result in violent reactions, has excogitated a more fundamental and comprehensive measure, of which I need say no more. Should His Majesty be successful, as who dares to doubt, then a peace, all to the advantage of the Goblin kingdom, will be established for a generation at least, rendered absolutely secure by the pledge which His Royal Highness the Prince will have and hold for the good behavior of her relatives. Should His Majesty fail, which who shall dare even to imagine in his most secret thoughts, there then will be the time for carrying out with rigor the design to which Glump referred, and for which our preparations are even now all but completed. The failure of the former will render the latter imperative." Curdie, perceiving that the assembly was drawing to a close, and that there was little chance of either plan being more fully discovered, now thought it prudent to make his escape before the goblins began to disperse, and slipped quietly away. There was not much danger of meeting any goblin, for all the men at least were left behind him in the palace, but there was considerable danger of his taking a wrong turning, for he had now no light, and had therefore depend upon his memory and his hands. After he had left behind him the glow that issued from the door of Glump's new abode, he was utterly without a guide. He was utterly without guide, so far as his eyes were concerned. He was most anxious to get back through the hole before the goblins should return to fetch the remains of their furniture. It was not that he was in the least afraid of them, but, as it was of the utmost importance that he should thoroughly discover what the plans they were cherishing were, he must not occasion the slightest suspicion that they were watched by a miner. He hurried on, feeling his way along the walls of rock. Had he not been very courageous, he must have been very anxious, for he could not but know that if he lost his way, it would be the most difficult thing in the world to find it again. Morning would bring no light into these regions, and towards him least of all, who was known as a special rhymester and persecutor, could goblins be expected to exercise courtesy. Well might he wish that he had brought his lamp and tinderbox with him, of which he had not thought when he crept so eagerly after the goblins. He wished it all the more when, after a while, he found his way blocked up and could get no farther. It was of no use to turn back, for he had not the least idea where he had begun to go wrong. Mechanically, however, he kept feeling about the walls that hemmed him in. His hand came upon a place where a tiny stream of water was running down the face of the rock. "What a stupid I am," he said to himself. "I am actually at the end of my journey, and there are the goblins coming back to fetch their things," he added. "And there are the goblins coming back to fetch their things," he added, as the red glimmer of their torches appeared at the end of the long avenue that led up to the cave. In a moment he had thrown himself on the floor and wriggled backwards through the door. The floor on the other side was several feet lower, which made it easier to get back. It was all he could do to lift the largest stone he had taken out of the hole, but he did manage to shove it in again. He sat down on the ore heap and thought. He was pretty sure that the latter plan of the goblins was to He was pretty sure the latter plan of the goblins was to inundate the mine by breaking outlets for the water accumulated in the natural reservoirs of the mountain, as well as running through portions of it, while the part hollowed by the miners remained shut off from that inhabited by the goblins. They had no opportunity of injuring them thus, but now that a passage was broken through, and the goblins' part proved the higher in the mountain, it was clear to Curdie the mine could be destroyed in an hour. Water was always the chief danger to which the miners were exposed. They met with a little choke damp sometimes, but never with the explosive fire damp so common in coal mines. Hence, they were careful as soon as they saw any appearance of water. As the result of his reflections while the goblins were busy in their old home, it seemed to Curdie that it would be best to build up the whole of his gang. It seemed to Curdie that it would be best to build up the whole of this gang, filling it with stone and clay or lime, so that there should be no smallest channel for the water to get into. There was not, however, any immediate danger, for the execution of the goblins' plan was contingent upon the failure of that unknown design which was to take precedence of it, and he was most anxious to keep the door of communication open, that he might, if possible, discover what the former plan was. At the same time, they could not resume their intermitted labors for the inundation without his finding it out, when by putting all hands to the work, the one existing outlet might in a single night be rendered impenetrable to any weight of water, for by filling the gang entirely up, their embankment would be buttressed by the sides of the mountain itself. Whew! Long sentences. Okay, there's some really, really $10 vocab words in this chapter, but I'm following it just fine so far. This would be a tough read for a little kid, I think. As soon as he found that the goblins had again retired, he lighted his lamp and proceeded to fill the hole he had made with such stones as he could withdraw when he pleased. He then thought it better, as he might have occasion to be up a good many nights after this, to go home and have some sleep. How pleasant the night air felt upon the outside of the mountain after what he had gone through in the inside of it. He hurried up the hill without meeting a single goblin on the way, and called and tapped at the window until he woke his father, who soon rose and let him in. He told him the whole story, and just as he had expected, his father thought it best to work that load no farther, but at the same time to pretend occasionally to be at work there still, in order that the goblins might have no suspicions. Both father and son then went to bed and slept soundly until the morning. All right, my voice is killing me. I'm gonna get a lamp in here to help me see a little bit better too. All right, not my best reading work, but actually I want to comment real quickly on the illustrations in this one. So in chapter 9, okay, so we saw Kirby with his sandwich. Now this was just a piece of bread in the book, so the illustrator missed that. I like how the illustrator emphasized the importance of squashing the feet of the goblins in this as their key weak point. And it's interesting that we got to see a little glimpse of the human wife, who we don't know too much about. And I like the use of framing to kind of imply that he's in darkness and surrounded by enemies. The illustrator made sure to highlight important moments, like almost alerting the goblins by touching their feet. And again, more emphasis on creating that cramped feeling, kind of creating a labyrinth of patterns you can follow. A really good example of following the description in the book, where it describes the high ceiling and the lights lighting everything up, and then a money shot of the king goblin, and I would assume his prince. So was that the last illustration? Then Curdie sneaking out and talking to his father at the end. Very nice. I love the illustrations. They're adding so much. That's it. I'm gonna call it a night here and give my voice a rest. Thank you for joining, and can't wait to finish it with you. With that, I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys. Catch you later.